Another task that we can be doing in the fall in our gardens is dividing some of our perennials. And the rule of thumb is for dividing, if it's something that's summer or fall blooming, it's better for the plant if you divide it in the spring. But if it's something that's more spring blooming, you can divide it in the fall. And basically there's 3 reasons to divide a plant, why you would want to divide a perennial. And the first reason is just to control the size of it. And that's also a great time to look at it, is in the fall. You remember how big that plant got to be during the summer, where in the spring when it starts out small, sometimes we forget how much space it actually takes up. But if the plant has just kind of outgrown its space, so maybe you have black-eyed Susans that just multiply with abandon, and the clump is just getting too large. So it's great to divide up the plant. Maybe you're moving the plants to different areas, so you might want to divide for that reason. But there's also some perennials that after so many years, you'll actually start to see the center of the plant will kind of die out. So you'll see that with your ornamental grasses, irises, a lot of the perennials, even coneflowers and that, is the whole center region of that clump of perennials will just not come up in the spring. And you'll just get growth coming around the outside. And so by dividing the perennials, what you're doing is digging up the outside pieces and then discarding that center, the kind of the main plant that you first planted. You discard the center area and just divide up the outside areas. So the one is to control the size of the plant, and the second reason is just to rejuvenate an old clump. There are some perennials that really never seem to thin out. Hostas are ones that usually we just need to divide because they have outgrown their area. There's some perennials that don't like to be divided at all. And you can go online and find a list. Peonies are one that if you divide, they probably won't bloom for a couple years afterwards. So make sure you're kind of doing a bit of research on your perennials. But basically, if it's more of a spring, early summer bloomer, the fall is a great time to divide that up. And when we're dividing perennials, what we're doing is we're going to dig out the entire clump of perennials, of the plants. And sometimes people just try to shovel into the ground and then just kind of break off pieces. But you really don't know how much root system you're getting until you're done, and by then it's too late. Because we usually put the shovel down on an angle, and so we're not getting as much of the bottom of the plants as what it looks like from the top. So it always best to lift up that entire clump, whether you're just putting it on the lawn or the garden beside you, or you might want to put out a tarp, and just lay it on the tarp. Most perennials, when you're dividing, depending on the size and that, you could usually divide it in at least 4 pieces. If it's a really large clump, say irises and that, you can divide it into many more pieces. But it also depends on what size of clumps you want to put back in. If you still want decent sized plants for the next season, maybe you're not dividing it as many pieces. Something like irises that have the rhizomes, usually you're dividing each rhizome apart and replanting those. Dig out into that entire clump and then decide kind of how many pieces you can cut that into. And just make sure in the fall when you're doing it, you'll still have the stems coming up from the summer and that. So make sure you have a few stems at least in each piece. And that's kind of assuring you have good growth in the spring. Sometimes you can just take the shovel and cut straight down into the separate pieces. There's some plants, even some of the grasses and daylilies, you almost need to take a knife and kind of cut through it that way. But then that's why it's important to see the root system before you start cutting away at it. So dig out the entire clump, cut it into the individual pieces, and before replanting any of it back into that area or into another area, make sure you're adding some good compost into it, improving the soil. That plant's been feeding on those nutrients in that soil for probably a few years, and so you want to replenish that before planting. So whether you're using a triple mix, it's great to add in like a composted sheep or cattle manure. You can get worm castings or kind of a seed kind of compost, mushroom compost, anything that's going to add nutrients back into that area. And also be using some fertilizer with bone meal in it. It's great to stay with organic fertilizers if you can, but you want a high middle number, and bone meal is a great one to give that to you. And that will just help feed the root system. So a few things to do before you put it back in. If you're replanting those portions of the perennials and your soil is really dry, make sure you just put some water into the hole as well and let that settle into the soil. And it just gets some moisture right around the root system so they can get going as quickly as possible. Make sure you fill in the soil around the clump that you've put back into the ground. Make sure it's about the same level as what it originally was. Things like irises and some of the other perennials, if you bury them too deep, they actually won't bloom for you the next season. So make sure you're putting them back in at the same level as what you took them out of the ground. And whether you're just dividing and spacing out the plants, whether you're giving some plants away, it's a great way to share perennials with neighbors and that. But now is a great time, once the perennials start going dormant, start turning their fall colors, it is the right time to be doing that. Here I have a Joe Pyeweed, which is a nice native perennial that attracts the butterflies and that, pollinators. And it's one that, say this is an older clump and it's just getting too large, and maybe the center is starting to die out on it. So the first thing I would do come the fall in that is kind of cutting it back a bit. So no matter what it is that you're dividing, whether it's some salvia or that you've had in the garden, if you cut it back, it's just easier to deal with the plants, and it doesn't harm it at this time of year at all. So just kind of cutting the stems back a bit. Here I have about 7 stems coming out of it. So this one I'd probably divide about in 3 pieces. I want to have about 2 stems in each clump if I can, just to ensure that I've got some good root growth. So again, we're going to dig it out of the ground, so exposing the root system, and then either taking the shovel and just kind of going down and kind of plan where you're going to be cutting it, or even just taking a nice knife. Just ask your wife if it's a knife that you can be using outside in the dirt before you do it. But just cut down through it and make sure that you're still getting a good piece of root system. Again, if the soil's up to here on the plants, when it gets into the ground, you want to make sure that the soil is at the same level into there and not be burying it too much deeper than that. There's some perennials that you can be dividing in that. There's like the hens and chicks, the succulents, that all you have to really do is just break off a piece. If you have prickly pear cactus is another one. Then you just take a piece off and lay it onto the soil, and by spring it'll be rooting on there for you. Those you probably want to do a little bit earlier, just so it has a chance to get rooting on it. The grasses are ones that you can be dividing either in the spring or the fall. I like leaving the grasses there for the winter just to get the texture of them. But again, if you're finding that this whole center, maybe it's been in the ground 5-6 years, and the whole center area hasn't been growing, that it was all just dead stubble in there this year. Again, it's something it's best to dig out the entire plant if possible. The grasses are a little bit tough to do that way. They just have a very strong root system. So make sure you have somebody with you to help out. And again, if the center area is all died out, say this is the center of the grass here, then once it's above ground and you're cutting through, you want to kind of cut all the way around that center region. There's no sense to save the center area at all. It's already done its job. So you can discard the center, and maybe you're cutting the outside into maybe 5 clumps or so, again, depending on what size it is. But again, just take your shovel, a good sharp shovel. I've done it with a pickaxe before. Some of them are really tough root system, but kind of divide up the outer pieces and then be replanting them wherever you'd like to in the garden. So it's a fairly simple thing, but if you don't do it, especially when you start seeing the clump die out in the center, if you're not rejuvenating at that time, within a couple of years, you'll just kind of lose the clump completely. So it is important to rejuvenate it, to get it back into full health, giving it more nutrients in the soil like we talked about, giving it some bone meal to give a good start. And you can keep perennials from year to year for many years just by doing simple tasks like this in the fall, or some will be in the spring. So if it's a late summer blooming one, the best to do in the springs, like your sedums, your coneflowers, your black-eyed Susans, more of a spring one. There's some that hostas, they don't really care what time of year it is. And daylilies kind of you can almost do any time as well. But if you're finding your clump is just thinning out, maybe it didn't flower as much this year for you as what it normally does, you might want to consider dividing it up.